Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us online for our gathering. I'd like to start with a few verses from Psalm 137. Keep trusting in the Lord and do what is right in his eyes. Fix your heart on the promises of God, and you will be secure, feasting on his faithfulness. Make God the utmost delight and pleasure of your life, and he will provide for you what you desire the most. Give God the right to direct your life, and as you trust him along the way, you'll find he pulled it off perfectly. I hope those words encourage you. I also want to just read a couple verses from Matthew as a reminder for us. If you're feeling weak, if you're feeling heavy and just struggling, I want to read these words that Jesus spoke as a word of encouragement for you again this morning as well. Are you weary, carrying a heavy burden? Then come to me. I will refresh your life, for I am your oasis. Simply join your life with mine, learn my ways, and you'll discover that I'm gentle, humble, easy to please. You will find refreshment and rest in me, for all that I require of you will be pleasant and easy to bear. Let's pray as we begin. Lord Jesus, we yield to your pace. Help us to step out of anxious hurry and into your gentle yoke. We hear your invitation to walk with you, to work with you, to watch how you do it. So Lord, help us to learn your unforced rhythms of grace this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Worship with us.
Love is mighty and so much stronger. The King of glory, the King above all kings, who shakes the whole earth with holy thunder and leaves us breathless in awe and wonder. The King of glory, the King above all kings. This is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Who brings our chaos back into order, who makes the orphan a son and daughter. The King of glory, the King of glory, who rules the nations with truth and justice, shines like the sun in all of its brilliance. The King of glory, the King above all kings. This is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Great is your faithfulness, O God. You wrestle with the sinner's restless heart. You lead us by still waters into mercy, and nothing can keep us apart. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. Your grace is enough, your grace is enough, your grace is enough for me. Great is your love and justice, God of Jacob. You use the weak to lead the strong. You lead us in the song of your salvation, and all your people sing along. So remember your people, remember your children, remember your promise, oh God. Your grace is enough, your grace is enough, your grace is enough for me. Yeah, your grace is enough. Heaven reaches out to us. Your grace is enough for me. God, I sing your grace is enough. I'm covered in your love. Your grace is enough for me. For me. For me.
Hey everyone, I've got a few announcements for you this morning. Now, I have heard from a few people as of late the comment that the announcements has kind of lost its funny over the last while. And I have to admit, that's true. But I also have to admit to you that I really don't have anything funny for you in the announcements this morning. However, I thought that perhaps I could wear a fun hat for each of the announcements. I know, we're kind of grasping at straws here, but we'll see if this works. Okay, the first announcement that I wanted to let you know about, by the way, this is my old Detroit Pistons hat that I had growing up. Still love this hat. First announcement is that donation receipts, year-end tax receipts for your donations, Sheila, our office administrator, has just put them in the mail, so you should expect to receive those shortly. Also, if you have given through our website, through Canada Helps, you should already have your donation receipts that were emailed to you as soon as you gave. If you need to contact Canada Helps, you are able to contact them to ask for any receipts that you need. We'll let you know more next week in the weekly email how to contact them regarding that. Thank you so much for your faithfulness in giving. We truly do want to thank you for your continued faithfulness and for the ways that you have continued to support our church. It's really, really encouraging. It's been very encouraging for the leadership of the church. So bless you for that. All right. Second announcement. It's a pretty good hat, eh? Second announcement is this. The best way to stay in touch with what's happening at our church and to stay in the know is to be on our weekly email subscription. These emails go out by Thursday afternoon each week, and many of you are already part of that. If you are not and you would like to be, all you have to do is email Sheila at the church office. Her email address is on the screen right here, and you can email Sheila and just ask to be added to the subscription list, and that'll just help you stay in touch. It's a really great way of staying in touch. All right, the third announcement has to do with something that I wrote to you in the email this week, and that's regarding prayer triads. And we just really want to encourage all of you to be part of a prayer. You know what? I can't talk about prayer and wear that hat. We want to encourage all of you to be part of a prayer triad. And the idea is that you would choose 2 other people to meet with on a weekly basis for about 20 minutes and simply to pray for one another. To meet via FaceTime or Skype, just on a group call, or to meet outdoors safely with one another, and simply to ask each other the question, what is one way that I can pray for you? Then allow people to share one way that you can pray for them, and then to do exactly that, to just take a few minutes and to support one another in prayer and to pray for one another. It'd take about 20-25 minutes of your week, and I think that that would be time very well invested. Just imagine if our whole church were connected in this way, praying for one another on a weekly basis. We need this. I think this would be an amazing thing. And this is something that you can set up on your own. You can just choose 2 people and just give them a call and ask them if they would be part of this. We need to be supporting one another in prayer all the time, but especially these days. And I think it would be a great thing for you to be a part of. So I just ask that you would consider that. Thanks, everyone.
Today's scripture reading comes from Romans 2, verses 12 to 16. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. And all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. This will take place on the day when God will judge men's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares.
Good morning, friends. I wanted to begin the message this morning by giving you just a personal update. You may notice that the setting of this video this morning is different than what you would normally see for me preaching, and that is because I am here in my home. I'm actually in my room, and the reason for that is because last week I actually tested positive for COVID-19, and I have no idea where I picked up the virus, but I have received a positive test, and so I have been in quarantine here in my room. Just to let you know, I'm doing fine physically. My symptoms have been minor, and so I'm grateful for that. And so just been dealing with the reality of being stuck in a room for a long period of time. And but as unpleasant as that is, I am very grateful for the fact that overall I am doing well, and I will be able to be free from quarantine on Sunday morning. So I'm grateful for that. So just a little bit of an update, and thank you for those who have been just encouraging me and praying for me. I appreciate that a great deal. This morning we are continuing on in our sermon series on the book of Romans. We have taken a break over Christmas and the first part of the new year, so we're going to pick things up this morning. If you've been with us, you know some of the things that we've been talking about is that Romans is this incredible book that was written by the Apostle Paul, inspired by the Holy Spirit, to give us this amazing understanding of the grace of God and our utter need for the grace of God for all humankind. And so in chapter 1, these amazing verses, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, Paul says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel being the good news about Jesus." He says, "because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile." And then Paul says this in verse 17. He says, "For in the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last." And this is one of the themes that we're going to see as we go through the book of Romans, that God has made a way for us to be made right with Him. It is a righteousness that is offered to us. It's not something that's earned by us, but it is a righteousness that is offered to us that can be received by faith. A righteousness outside of ourselves that is given to us through Jesus. And in chapter 1 and 2, Paul is making the case that both Jew and Gentile are all not only accountable before God, but are all stand guilty and condemned before a holy God because of our sin, because we have fallen short. And no one escapes this predicament. We all fall into that category of falling short of the glory of God. And Paul is spending a lot of time in these first couple of chapters making that case. And it's, in a sense, all pointing to chapter 3 at this point in the book of Romans, where Paul is going to give this great summary statement in chapter 3, verse 23, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But then he goes on to describe the good news of the way that God has provided for us to be made right with Him, and it's pure grace that is received by faith. We don't do it by being good enough. We don't earn it. It's all about grace. So that's where things are headed in the book of Romans, and that's why I believe chapter 3 is just such an important chapter in this book. And you'll see in the weekly emails that our weekly memory verses for the next while are going to be focused in chapter 3. And I think we would all do well to memorize, to hide away in our hearts a great deal of chapter 3, because there's so many great truths for us. This morning, we're going to look at chapter 2, verses 12 to 16. Chapter 2, verses 12 to 16. You've all, I'm sure, heard of the phrase, seeing the forest for the trees. And, you know, what that means is that sometimes we forget to see the big picture and we get lost in the details, in the trees. And we need to pull back and see the whole forest. We need to remember the big picture of what's going on. And in the book of Romans, I think that is just such a very important thing to remember. You know, one of the things that I've thought about as in terms of my approach to preaching through the book of Romans is how long do we take to go through this book? How much time do we spend on individual verses? Because you can spend one entire sermon on one verse or half a verse, and you can dissect the verse and spend a lot of time doing that. And there's value in doing that. But when you do that, I believe that you always have to remember that you have to pull back constantly and remember the big picture. What is God trying to do overall in the book of Romans? Because we can look at a particular verse and we can get a little confused if we don't remember the big picture. And that's the case in the verses that we have this morning. The forest of the book of Romans, I believe, is God's incredible and necessary grace and how utterly dependent we are on it. The big picture of the book of Romans is the amazing grace of God and how we can receive that by faith and how utterly dependent we are on the grace of God. Speaking of utter dependence, I have been experiencing that in my time of quarantine. My lovely wife, Coralie, who she and Ben are also in quarantine, but I'm separated from them. But she has been bringing me food, multiple times throughout the day, and I realize how utterly dependent I am on her delivering food to me. And so anytime that I am tempted to get a little cheeky with her or to try to bug her a little bit too much, I am very much reminded that if I don't watch it, I might just starve here in this bedroom of mine. That's a terrible example for our utter dependence on the grace of God, but that's the forest of the book of Romans, how utterly dependent we are on the grace of God. That's the big picture. That's where we're headed this morning in the message, is to remember the grace of God and how desperate we are for God's grace. But for the next few minutes, let's take a wander through the trees of these verses from chapter 2. So let's look at chapter 2, verse 12. Paul says, "All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law." Now, this verse on its own is not good news. Paul here is distinguishing between Gentiles and Jews, and he says all who sin apart from the law, meaning Gentiles, who by and large did not have the law of God in their possession. And he says all who sin apart from the law will perish apart from the law. And then he says all who sin under the law, referring to Jews because they had the law of God at their disposal, all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. And as we'll find out, that's not good news either. And then Paul says in verse 13, he says, "For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous." This idea of being righteous in God's sight or being declared righteous in God's sight, it means being in a state of being right with God, being declared right in right relationship with God, being acquitted before God on that day of judgment that Paul talks about in verse 16. And Paul says it's not those who hear the law who will be made declared right before God, meaning here he's primarily talking to Jews, those Jews who had access to the law, who would hear the law being read to them. Most Jews didn't have access to a physical copy of the scriptures in their homes as we do. And a lot of Jews at that point couldn't even read the scriptures for themselves, but they would go to their place of worship, to the temple, and they would hear the law of God being read to them. And that was a privilege. And I think Paul here is partly after those who were putting their confidence in the wrong places, putting their confidence in the fact that they thought they were a privileged people because they had the law and they heard the law being read. And some of them were fond of thinking that the mere possession of the law, that they were this privileged people who had the law of God, that this meant somehow eternal security, as some of them thought. But that's not what it means, as Paul is going to let us know about. Having the law doesn't guarantee anything, Paul is saying. The law is not like some good luck charm that the Jews could hang on to and bank on. In fact, as Leon Morris, a commentator, puts it, he says, law means judgment. Because they have the law and know what God demands in the law, they will be judged by the law. They will be judged by the requirements of the law. And again, that's not good news. So this is where things can get a little confusing in this verse if we're not kind of constantly backing up and seeing the big picture of what Paul is doing in the book of Romans. Because it can seem in this verse, if you just read this verse, it can seem as if Paul is saying that someone can be right before God, someone can be declared right or righteous before God by obeying the law. through their own effort, that somehow if they just obey the law enough, they can be declared righteous or right before God. But this can't be what Paul is saying in this verse. That this runs counter to everything else that Paul is saying in the book of Romans. It runs counter to Paul's main argument that all have sinned and that all fall short of the glory of God, that every one of us are in need of outside help. This runs counter to Paul, who says in chapter 3, verse 20, where he says, actually, therefore no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. And again, in verse 28 of chapter 3, Paul says this, for we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from observing the law. So in chapter 2, verse 13, Paul is not saying that if you obey the law, just, on that alone, on your own effort, you can be made right with God. That's not what Paul here is saying. So why does Paul write verse 13 the way he writes it? Well, I think what Paul here is doing is he's addressing people who are putting their confidence in their Jewishness, in having the law, in hearing the law, that they were this privileged people. And later on in chapter 2, Paul is going to go after those who were putting their confidence in their Jewish heritage, in the fact that they were circumcised. And Paul is saying all of these things, if you're standing on that and that's your hope of being made right with God, that's a faulty foundation. That's sinking sand. So I think Paul here is saying that, look, if you're going to go the way of the law, of obeying the law as a way to be made right with God, then Paul is saying you must obey the law. You must obey actually all of the law. And we know that people just don't do this. They can't do this. Elsewhere in Paul's writing says actually our sinful nature prevents us from doing that very thing. Then in verse 14 and 15, Paul says, Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. So Paul, in these verses, Paul is speaking of Gentiles, that is non-Jewish people, and he's saying even though they don't have the written law in the same way, of course, that Jews had possession of the law, Paul says actually you do have it. Paul says that God has written his law on your heart, and he says when Gentiles do by nature or by what seems to be instinct things that God requires in the law, so for example, if they honor their parents, or if they choose not to steal, their basic knowledge of right and wrong, these things show that God actually has written his law on their hearts. There is a fundamental knowledge of right and wrong and what God requires on the human heart. God has written that on our hearts. C.S. Lewis talks about this in his book Mere Christianity. In the opening page, he says this, "Everyone has heard people say things like this. How'd you like it if anyone did the same thing to you? Or, give me a bit of your orange, I gave you a bit of mine." And he says, the man who says this is appealing to some standard of behavior which he expects the other to know about. Meaning, there is this common knowledge in human beings, this common understanding of right and wrong. And Paul here is saying that when Gentiles do by nature or by instinct some of the things that are required by the law, it shows that God has given them the law, that God has written the requirements of the law on their hearts, and they do obey God's law. Although not all of the law, because Paul says their consciences also accuse them. So this is a quote from Tim Keller. He kind of summarizes what I believe Paul is saying in these first few verses from his book written on the book of Romans. Tim Keller says this, Paul is saying that God is right to judge those who know the law but have not kept it. And Paul is also warning that God will rightfully judge those who don't know the law externally, but they know it internally, yet have not kept it. So Paul basically is saying Jews and Gentiles are without excuse. And this does not make the judgment then that Paul talks about in verse 16, when Paul says, "This will take place on the day when God will judge men's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares." This does not make that day of judgment seem very appealing, does it? And it's not appealing without the grace of God. It's not appealing if we only see the trees and we don't back up and see the grand picture, the forest, the good news of the gospel of Jesus, of grace being given to us, grace being offered to every human being, because we are utterly in need of and utterly dependent on the grace of God. Chapters 1 and 2 and the first part of chapter 3 in the book of Romans, it can feel like tough slugging. Because if you take your time and go through these verses, they on their own, they're filled with what seems to be a lot of bad news, just tough stuff, as Paul walks us through human depravity, as Paul walks us through the reality that we all have fallen short, that none of us are without excuse, of our dire consequences without the grace of God in our lives. And it can feel like tough slugging, but at the same time, when we take time to understand the depth of sin, when we take time to understand our dire need for God's grace and His mercy in our lives, it ought to lead us to a place where we savor and appreciate and glory in the amazing grace of God in our lives. The grace of God is the foundation on which we stand. When we lived in Calgary, we built a new house. This was our first home, and after the home was built, we decided that we wanted a deck, so I decided to build a deck in our backyard. And when I say that I decided to build a deck, what I mean is that I decided to hire someone to build a deck for us, because I did not know how to build a deck. If I tried to build a deck, I'm surely one of us would have perished in that process. So we hired someone to build a deck. And one of the things that I noticed just driving through the neighborhood and through the back alleys, because it was a newer subdivision, is that lots of people were building decks, and some people didn't put the right foundation in. They used concrete slabs, blocks that they just put right on the ground underneath the deck. And inevitably what would happen is that the deck, as the ground settled, the deck would start to go like that. And it would just be this, it would look terrible, and it would be an unsteady foundation. And so when the person built our deck, they put in the proper foundation. In these opening chapters, I believe that what Paul is doing here, he is trying to strip away faulty foundations. And he's pointing both Jews and Gentiles to the only foundation, to the only firm, the only sure foundation that exists when it comes to making us right with God. And that's Jesus, and that's His grace. I mentioned to you a number of Sundays ago that one of the artists that I grew up listening to, that I loved listening to, was Keith Green. Many of his songs impacted me. One of the songs that had an impact on me was "Grace by Which I Stand." And in that song, Keith Green, he sings this. He says, "I wish it had been explained that as you're growing, you must remember that nothing lasts except the grace of God by which I stand. And Jesus, I know that I would surely fall away except for grace by which I'm saved." You know, as you're growing in your relationship with God, one of the things that can begin to creep in, of course, is discouragement. That as you're seeking to grow in holiness, as you're seeking to obey God, those are good pursuits. But what can happen is that we begin to struggle in those pursuits of holiness and struggle in our obedience. And it can lead to self-condemnation very quickly. And friends, I want to remind you, God does care about your holiness. God does care about your obedience. Those are worthy pursuits. We ought to pursue those things. But that's not in any way, shape, or form the foundation on which we stand before God. It's only His grace that serves as the solid foundation for our relationship with God. Another application, as we talk about the grace of God, is that as we remember God's amazing grace shown to us, this ought to remind us that there is no room for division in the church. And I understand that this is not part of the immediate text that we have considered this morning. This is not one of the applications of this text, but it's one of the great applications of the book of Romans. And again, pulling back to see the forest for the trees, this is part of where Paul is going. This level ground that Paul is putting every one of us on reminds us that there's no room for division, that as we have been shown grace and mercy by God, as we are desperately in need of grace and mercy from God, so we ought to show grace and mercy to others. So we ought to see that others need grace and mercy from us. Friends, we must constantly fight against those things in the church that threaten unity and that war against love. Because we are a community of people whose very foundation is grace. It's what we are to be about. Grace not only saves us, but grace is also to be our constant true north when it comes to our relationships with others. Grace is all about being treated in a way that we do not deserve. This is how God has treated us, and this is how we are to treat one another. We are in a time in the church where, as you know, there are all sorts of different opinions on this, that, and everything out there. This past year, these past couple years especially have shown us that there's all sorts of potential for division in the church. There are all sorts of different opinions that are pulling people in all sorts of different directions. Opinions about politics, opinions about Black Lives Matters, as we have seen that issue over the last year. Opinions about COVID-19 and what's the proper response and what should the church be doing or what should not the church be doing. All sorts of opinions out there that can very quickly lead to polarization in the church, very quickly can lead to division in the church and judgment in the church. Philip Yancey, I've been rereading the book that he wrote called Vanishing Grace. And he writes this: "The issue is not whether I agree with someone, but rather how I treat someone with whom I profoundly disagree. I doubt God keeps track of how many arguments we win. God may indeed keep track of how well we love. When I ask, tell me the first word that comes to your mind when I say Christian, not one time has someone suggested the word love. Yet without question, that is the proper biblical answer." In this book, Philip Yancey also talks about a man named Francis Collins. Francis Collins directed the Human Genome Project towards its triumphant goal of mapping all 3 billion letters of the human genetic code. Collins also identifies himself as a committed Christian, and he is engaged in public debates with the likes of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and others. This is what Yancey writes about Francis Collins. He says, "As I've watched his career, one thing impresses me more than his many achievements, and that's this: how he treats his opponents. On periodic visits to Oxford, he has tea with Richard Dawkins. Similarly, he met often with the militant atheist Christopher Hitchens, author of God is Not Great. And when Collins learned that Hitchens had esophageal cancer, he called to offer help. He said, as NIH director, I approve many government-funded research grants, and I know about some rather cutting-edge approaches based on cancer genomics." Over the next few months, Francis Collins spent hours with Christopher Hitchens and his family going over options for treatments. Christopher Hitchens lived with his cancer for a year and a half, an ordeal that he chronicled regularly in columns for Vanity Fair magazine. He told of receiving hateful messages from Christians. Yet one of Christopher Hitchens' last columns paid tribute to Francis Collins, whom he described as one of the greatest living Americans and our most selfless Christian physician. I want to leave you with this thought from the book of Hebrews. In the book of Hebrews, the writer says this: "See to it that no one misses the grace of God. See to it that no one misses the grace of God. First of all, friends, see to it that you don't miss the grace of God. Paul, in these verses, he's again pulling away faulty foundations. He's saying, yes, we are all without excuse, but he's pointing us to the one true foundation, that is the grace of God. Remember your foundation. Remember your hope. See to it that you don't miss the grace of God. And see to it that others in your life don't miss out on the grace of God. They don't miss seeing the grace of God. People that you worship with in church, your friends, people in our community, see to it that no one misses the grace of God. People can catch a glimpse of the grace of God. People can receive a taste of the grace of God through you, through the way that you treat them, through the way that you treat people that you love, but also through the way that you treat people with whom you have massively different opinions, through the way that you treat people who don't treat you very well, through the way that you treat perfect strangers. People can begin to see and taste the grace of God, the very grace that you depend on. They can see that and taste that through you. See to it, friends, that no one misses out on the grace of God. Bless you.
Sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. Because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Have we trials and temptations? Is there trouble anywhere? We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Can we find a friend so faithful who will all our sorrows share? Jesus knows our every weakness. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Oh, what a friend we found. What a friend we found. What a friend we found in you. Oh, what a friend we found. What a friend we His face shine upon you and be gracious